Babylon is a 1980 release British drama directed by Franco Rosso.
It focuses on a young black man by the name of Blue, who is, well, he's a mechanic by day, and at night he's a DJ in a local reggae club. And yeah, in the background there's like a sound system competition upcoming between him and his guys and another crew. Who's got the best, loudest sound system and who's got the best, latest reggae music. But the main sort of thrust of the story is the struggle that they go through, living in London, the sort of the racism and the prejudice and the poverty and the struggle, the daily struggle that they face, just getting on with their lives. At first it feels a little bit aimless plot-wise. The first sort of half an hour you're not quite sure where it's going, but then it does just pick up and the plot starts to unfold.
So you'll have to excuse our ignorance a little bit, maybe, when it comes to the terminology and the music side of things in this. I mean, it's a sound system culture, which was very big in the early 80s, late 70s, that kind of came from the streets. They have these huge speaker stacks and things like that. And I think a lot of it, and there is a scene in the beginning of this film where they go to he's almost like a record label. And they're in there and they're playing music to each other and they're trying to buy these tracks. And I think what they did is the music was pre-recorded and then they would rap or toast over it. Yeah. And you'd get the DJ rapping over it or speaking over it or singing over it as well. And that's what this kind of sound system culture is. And it's still very big, and they kind of run it in clubs and dub music and reggae, and then dub music came out of it as well. We're kind of following on from last week. We thought we'd do another few films on black cinema and show you what's out there. Although this film's actually directed by an Italian. A man named Franco Rosso, who came over to Italy. He was born in Turin in Italy, and then he came over to England when he was about 7 or 8 years old. Possibly he felt a similar backlash towards him being an immigrant that a lot of black people felt at the beginning of the 80s and during the 70s as well, when, obviously London was going through what America was going through and probably still is going through. I think that's what's quite interesting about this film, much like Watermelon Man last week, is that unfortunately a lot of the things going on in this film are still relevant today.
Yeah, I mean, there's a scene where they store their equipment in like a garage under a railway, and there's flats opposite, and there's a scene where they're playing some music quite loud, and one of the neighbours comes banging on the door. They have a conversation. She, shows herself as a massive racist. And she goes on about how, this is a nice place before you lot came along. Why don't you go back where you came from? Which, is a classic thing that's said, these days. He says, I was born here and it's never been nice. Just because the colour of your skin is different doesn't mean you weren't born in this country. These stupid assumptions that people make. And there's, I've heard the same things said now about, the Black Lives Matter movement, and, people saying that, if you don't like it here, go home. It's like, well, we are home. This is our home. This is where we were born. So it's a nonsense argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's interesting about this film. I said this last week as well. Obviously, we are white, and so we haven't experienced what a lot of black people and Asian people and Indian people have suffered in this country and in America and other countries around the world as well. But obviously, this what happened in America in the 50s, 60s didn't happen here. I mean, the lynching that they had in America, as far as we didn't have that level of racism here. But what's really interesting, we clearly have a problem with the police and racial profiling. What's also really interesting I found about this film is that one thing that really is the same is the poverty levels. That kind of how if you were black, you came over here, but there was nothing really to come to. There was, they were treated so poor and, really scummy looking kind of estates that they grow up in that they still live in today. That's something that really hasn't gone away, and people still live. There's still no money for them, and that's one thing I really got from this. I suppose London doesn't quite look like the dump it did in the 70s. Bomb sites that still exist. After the war, you still got sites of run-down houses. I mean, that's something that's obviously not like, that has changed. I think the 80s had a real kind of boom in housing and social housing and whatnot. But it's quite grim.
It's set in London, but you don't see any landmarks. It doesn't show any shots of Big Ben or Tower Bridge or anything like that. I mean, they go to Piccadilly Circus very briefly. Even then, it's a bit seedy, and you don't really see much of of the sort of the touristy bits. It doesn't try and say, "Oh, look at this lovely city." It's showing the dark alleys and the run down poor areas.
Yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. It's showing the parts that the parts of London that most films might not, that might steer away from. It reminded me a little bit of La Haine, the French film, because in that film again, the beginning of that film, most of that film is kind of not showing the Paris that you know as a tourist. Although there is a scene in there where they do go, much like in here, there's a scene where they go out into the kind of central Paris, and you do see the Eiffel Tower. But for the beginning of the film, it's all like it's looking at the parts of Paris that the government perhaps don't want you to see on tourist information videos and things like that. And this film does that completely. It's looking at, I think most of it was filmed around Deptford and Brixton.
Yeah. At the end of the day, every big city has areas like that. There's no big city that doesn't have poor, run-down areas. It's just a fact of life.
I've seen this film before, and I do enjoy it. I think it's a really good film. I think it's a very powerful film. I think it's quite sad that in the 1970s, I think there are only three. But there was a film called Pressure, and there was another film as well. And there were like these three films that featured predominantly black casts and were about black culture and black society. But this one, I think, is a very powerful one. I haven't seen the other ones myself, so I couldn't say what they're like. But I just think it's really interesting how similar this is to films like, we spoke about Scum and Made in Britain, and films by Ken Loach, films by Alan Clark. But this film is severely underrated. It's not. It rarely gets spoken about next to those films, and I think it's just as good and as powerful as those films. But again, I think that kind of shows, doesn't it? These things don't get shown as much, and I know for a fact it was only shown in America last year, 2019.
Yeah. I mean, it is very specific to its time and place, and it is a fascinating snapshot into that time. I mean, to be fair, there's a lot of Jamaican slang in it, which I did find hard to follow at some times. There's some points we have to really concentrate on what they're saying to get the gist of it. Living in this country, some of that is familiar already, kind of, what they're talking about. But from another country, you might have very little chance of following a lot of what is said. Whether you want to watch it with subtitles, maybe.
I don't know if I watched it on Amazon. I don't think it had subtitles on there.
I think the Blu-ray does have subtitles, but no, on Amazon, probably a bit stuck. But it's one of those films where you kind of get the gist of what's happening, even if you don't catch every word. You are just sort of absorbing almost like a piece of, like I say, a snapshot of a time and place, because it's it looks authentic. And it's about a real place and real people and real problems. It kind of you get absorbed into that period, even if you don't know exactly what's being said at all times. You still get the gist.
It's filmed. It reminds me. Well, it reminds me a lot of British cinema. A lot of British cinema has this kind of the whole kitchen sink gritty realism snapshot of life. A lot of British cinema is like that, and that's why this one. It stands out by itself because of the culture it's looking at, but at the same time it's very similar to a lot of other British films, like I said, by people like Alan Clark, Ken Loach. I mean, there's a great Ken Loach film called Sweet 16, which is made in Glasgow, and I have to put the subtitles on for that because I can't understand a thing they're saying, even though they're speaking English.
I would say if there's a film that everyone has heard of that is kind of similar. A similar subject anyway is maybe Boys in the Hood. While obviously it's a completely different country, it's still looking at the same sort of problems. Young black guys facing poverty and prejudice and police brutality and etc. etc. So it's similar kind of themes. Very different time and place, but ultimately similar kinds of films. So if you've seen Boys in the Hood, then I would definitely consider checking this one out for a similar sort of experience.
And also, I think films like Spike Lee did things like Do the Right Thing, and a lot of his films also featured very similar. Looking at the ghettos and the hoods of black families. And obviously, yeah, it was 10 years after this one. Who made Boys and Who? Was it John Singleton?
John Singleton, I think.
Yeah, and yes, so it's people like him and Spike Lee. Yes, if you're familiar with those films, and then if you're familiar also with people like Alan Clark and Ken Loach and Mike Lee and people like that, you kind of put those two together and you get a film like Babylon. This film looks great. I mean, the cinematography is really great. The cinematographer was Chris Menges, who went on to do things like The Killing Fields and The Mission and films like that, and so he clearly has a great eye, and it's got that very realistic feel.
Definitely. Yeah.
Like I said, you're looking at London at a specific time, and it really feels like London. It feels like a real and what's going on in there. I mean, there's some quite funny moments in there. Of course, it's it's a kind of a coming of age film as well. So it's young people growing up on the streets, and there's some nice amusing moments in there. The fashion's great, and obviously it all looks looks and feels very authentic. It also, while I was watching it, I thought, God, this really feels like Quadrophenia. I mean, obviously it's that whole youngsters who listen to music and they're going to clubs and hanging out and doing the things that teenagers do, and strangely it was written by the same person, Martin Stellman. He wrote the screenplay for this, and he wrote the screenplay for Quadrophenia as well. But I thought that's also an interesting thing going on in here, because in both those films, this one obviously deals with racism, and there's like members of maybe possible National Front members in here. You've got the police racial profiling, but then what you also got, which is similar to Quadrophenia, is the kind of the inside violence. The violence in your own race. Black on black, white on black, white on white in Quadrophenia, which was the mods versus the rockers. And I think that's quite interesting. If we stamp out racism, we've then got to stamp out the violence and the ignorance and the prejudice within our own races, which is another problem on top of the racism issue. So I think that shows that here. There's a white character in this film who's friends with them, and when it kind of all starts to fall apart, even he's like looked upon negatively. They just had enough of the prejudice that surrounds them, and he's they take it out on him, sadly, even though he's nothing but a friend to them, and defends them, and I found there's a few scenes in this that I found quite moving and quite powerful, actually. And it's not necessarily stuff I haven't seen before on British film, but I thought it was done really well, and I think this is a good film, and it's kind of worth seeing.
If people have heard of it, it's more than likely through the music that's in it. I think the soundtrack was very popular, and of course, the guy that plays Blue, who's Brinsley Forde, for a long time was part of Aswad, a big reggae band from the 70s, and who are still going now. He's not in the band anymore, but they are still going. If you are into that kind of music, or even if you're not, it's still a great soundtrack.
Yeah, no, the soundtrack's great, and I listened to it on. I found the soundtrack on Spotify, and I mean, the music of Aswad, a lot of people over here would probably know. I mean, I think he had a few hits in the charts, I think, back in the 80s, and you definitely recognise his music. He is brilliant in this film. I mean, it is his film, although it features the other kids as well, and even a great cameo from Mel Smith from Smith and Jones in there. His long hair flailing about the place. Which is amusing. I totally get you with that. I think you're right. I mean, it is a film that doesn't have much of a plot to speak of, and it is just a snapshot of a time, but a really well shot snapshot, and it's very memorable, and it's got some really memorable music in there, and it's got some really memorable acting and scenes. And I think I think a lot of people, I've read a few reviews. There's a really interesting interview, if you can find it, with Brinsley Forde on Vice.com, where he talks about the film, and in fact he talks about why, because apparently it was banned in America for a long time.
Oh, right.
And apparently when it was shown, because it was shown at the Cannes Film Festival, and it won an award there, but even there people were a little bit unsure what to make of it. I think it was shown in America, or shown somewhere, and someone took offence. There's a stabbing scene in the film. It wasn't the act of violence that they took offence with. What they took offence with was the underdog taking revenge. I won't speak about what happened when that scene takes place, but it was that what they were afraid of was the underdog taking revenge, and that might incite riots in America. So that's what they were terrified of. It was still, it was controversial here as well. It got an X rating in this country, but no, in America it was not released until last year, 2019. It was crazy, but they seem to have they really love it over there. The people who've seen it that write about it really have taken it on board, and obviously yes, it's very similar to what goes on over there as well. So I recommend it if you don't know it. So we don't have it on DVD, but I watched it. I've seen it before, like I said, but we watched it on Amazon. We rented it on there. In this country, you can get it for 99p. Woohoo!
Bargain.
Yeah, but I did read that it's on the Criterion channel in America.
Yep.
So you can, if you're over there, you can get it. You can get it on that.
If you want it on disc, there was a Blu-ray released in the UK about 2009, I think. It's got a commentary on it, and it's got a Q&A with the cast. I think was recorded the previous year, so that's available. And last year, I think after it was released theatrically briefly, there was a Blu-ray released by Kino Lorber. Same transfer, which is really nice. The version on Amazon, it looked pretty good for streaming.
Yeah,
it's got the features that were on the UK disc, but it's also got a load of other stuff as well. So quite a lot of background, behind the scenes stuff that you can check out. Obviously, being Kino Lorber, all their stuff is usually locked to Region A. So unfortunately, if you can't play Region A, you won't be able to get that. But the UK disc is all regions, so anywhere in the world can play that.
No, I mean, I'd recommend going, tracking it down, giving it a watch, because I thought, it's really good. And obviously, again, much like Watermelon Man last week, it's sadly still quite relevant, this film. So that was Babylon, and as always, if you enjoyed the video, let us know in the comments below.
Yep, hit the subscribe button there, and don't forget to hit the bell for notifications. There's some other videos to check out over here. Come and find us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And join us next week for another video.